So our goal now is to take our cube and create the dust particles that are inside and outside of the cube. And 2 of the 5 geometry node techniques that we're going to start to get to know are going to be distributions and instancing. And our very first step to doing distributions and instancing is setting up our distribute nodes. So where do we start? If we just jump in here and start doing a search, we're going to start to have a lot of issues where we don't really know what to expect and what to do. So first, let's explore the add menu. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here that we're going to be covering as we go. And I'm going to give you some subcategories so you can start playing around with it with yourself as well. Now, a distribute, all it's doing is it's creating a point cloud for us. So we know that if we want to do a distribution, we need to check out the points submenu. Specifically, we have 2 different types of distributions to work with. Distribute points in volume and distribute points on faces. Now, in this particular case, because we want the points to go inside and outside, we want to use a volume to be able to do this distribution. So go ahead and click this and drop it in there to auto connect it. And we're going to see we have an issue. And the issue is we no longer see what's happening here. So what is happening here and how do we fix it? And we're going to get a little bit of a hint here with Blender, and it's going to give us a little attention icon up here. Now, the broader problem that we're looking at here is that with geometry nodes, the differences between edit mode and geometry nodes is that with edit mode, whenever we're making modifications, we can generally see them happening in the viewport in real time. Whereas with geometry nodes, it's very common to do something and just have it not do any effect at all. So usually there's some kind of a notification that we can see in the network to be able to do this. And if I hover over this, we'll see that, okay, input geometry now has an unsupported type mesh. What does this error message mean and how do we actually fix it? Well, we notice that the input here says volume, which means this particular node is expecting a volume. And the type that it got is a mesh. I'm going to hit M to mute that. We can see that the mesh data type is what we started with here. We have all this data within our mesh. So what we need to do here is transfer it from the mesh into a volume, which brings us to step number 2, which is doing a mesh to volume conversion. I'm going to hit M to unmute that, and then we're going to do an add menu again. Now, whenever we need to do conversion, we can just go straight to the mesh menu here because that is the mesh type that we started with. That's because we know that because that's what our geometry node spreadsheet up here is telling us. So mesh menu, and then we have our conversions up here. So we can do mesh to curve, mesh to points, and for this particular case, we want mesh to volume. So click that, auto connect it. And now we all of a sudden start to see something happening in the viewport. And we officially have no errors within our network. And what we also start to see is that we have a point cloud, right? So now we have 13 points within our point cloud. But we're going to run into another problem in here is if I just do another render, or if I do a render image here, we'll see that the render shows up blank. Why is this? What's happening here? Well, the point cloud is just a point cloud. It doesn't actually render or do anything. At least it doesn't do it in Eevee. In Cycles, it sort of does. But in Eevee, we just don't get anything. And that brings us to step number 3, which is setting up our instances. So an instance happens whenever we take a mesh object or any object and we apply it to each individual point of our point cloud. And if we go to our add menu, come down to instances, we can start working with these. And at the very top, we're going to have this instance on points. Notice that it's not going to be instance 2 points because instance 2 points, that's doing a conversion. We don't want to do a conversion here. We just want to do instance on points. And then I'll go ahead and auto connect it in between my volume and my outputs. Now we run into another problem, and that's because we don't actually see anything. Once again, that brings us to step number 4, which is accessing our mesh primitive menu to add in a primitive object to instance onto. So just like our add menu up here, we have access to this mesh submenu, and we can create, cubes, spheres, triangles, whatever we want. In our add menu down here, we have access to mesh primitives, which gives us access to very, very similar objects. And in this particular case, we're going to drop down an isosphere. So I'll click to add that, and then I'm going to drop it right next to my instance on points. And then I'm going to take the mesh output and plug that into the instance input. Now you might be wondering, well, why is it okay if we go from mesh to instance, but we can't go from like mesh to volume? Certain nodes and geometry nodes just expect certain data, and it oftentimes will do conversion for us to make it a bit more user-friendly, but sometimes it does it. We'll cover more of this as we go. And now we start to see that we have some data actually happening in our viewport again. And now all we have to do is go ahead and scale down our radius. I'll scale this down to 0.05. And now we can see our dust particles are looking really small. And now if we want more of these, we just go back to our distribute node and we can just simply increase the density. So I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to leave off with a value of 50 on my density. And a special bonus note here, we'll notice that we have density on our mesh to volume and our density on the distribute points node. We want to do it on the distribute points because that's what's going to actually create more points to work with. And the reason why I'm pointing this out to you now, because if you increase this value too much, your scene can crash. You don't want to mess with the mesh to volume unless you really know what you're doing. Too much density in a volume can, be very, very heavy, very, very quickly. And there we go. And we'll have the full node network in the cheat sheets below.